Welcome to the Independent School Podcast with me, Juliette Corbett. As an executive coach and strategy advisor, I guide senior leaders in the world of education to find their strategic focus, empower their teams, and regain control over their time, helping them to go from exhausted to strategic. On this podcast, I share the ideas and tips that I've developed over the years to help the leaders I've worked with one-to-one, so that I can help you to focus on your priorities and achieve your goals with confidence and ease. And this week, I have a treat in store for you. I am delighted to be joined by Jim Knight, or to give him his full title, the Right Honourable Lord Knight of Weymouth. Jim has extensive experience across all elements of the education sector, both in the UK and internationally. And I took this opportunity to talk to him about the big picture of education. So we cover some of the really big global challenges that we are all experiencing, regardless of sector. And we discuss the impact of those on the education sector and what we should be doing. Firstly, to help our young people be fully prepared to thrive in the world, and a world that we can't necessarily imagine with any accuracy as we sit here right now. Also to think about the impact of the climate emergency and the role of schools in both reducing their carbon footprint and preparing our young people to really lead the agenda with regards to climate action in the years to come. We also talk about AI. It's kind of inevitable that we were going to touch on this topic, but we really dive into the idea of what is it that we can do as schools. We don't want to be in denial. We don't want to fully lean into AI without first understanding some of the risks and some of the disadvantages of using AI. So what is it that we can do to have a balanced approach in our schools? We also talk about educational inequality, and as you'll hear in a moment, Jim has experience from both the state sector and the independent sector to make the argument for how those two sectors can be learning from each other. And then finally, what I'm delighted about is that Jim then dives down into the smaller day-to-day details about how he juggles a whole variety of different roles and how he ensures that he's protecting his ability to think strategically, to be prioritising strategically in order to have the impact that he seeks to have in the world. So, as you may know, Jim Knight works across the sectors of education, digital technology, and also as a legislator. He's a director of Suklaa Ltd, providing advice to clients in education. He's also chair of the trust board of EACT Multi-Academy Trust, the chair of COBIS, the Council of British International Schools. He's a board member of Century Tech, MACAT International, and Educate Ventures Research Limited. And he sits on the advisory bodies for Nord Anglia Education, Pearson and BETT. As a government minister and MP, Jim's portfolios included rural affairs, schools, digital and employment. He was a member of Gordon Brown's cabinet before then joining the Lords in 2010. He regularly speaks in the Lords on education and technology policy, and actually he reflects on some of the thinking that he's been doing around AI regulation as well in our interview. So as I said, you really are in for a treat as you listen to Jim and I talking about some of the big picture trends that we're seeing at the moment. So without any further ado, here's my interview with Jim Knight. So Jim, welcome to the Independent School Podcast. It is fantastic to have you with us here today.
Thanks very much, Juliette. It's a joy to be with you.
Wonderful. So first of all, before we dive into some big topics that we want to talk about around education, I would love to hear about the root of your passion for education. Neither of us have stood up in a classroom and taught, but both of us have this really deep-rooted connection to the sector. Is there a reason for that for you? What's the root of that passion that you have for education?
It's a question I occasionally ask myself, really, because I've been preoccupied by education since 2006, when Tony Blair, then UK Prime Minister, asked me to be schools minister, which I did for 3 years, and that experience really captured my interest. And look, I think I've always been interested, as a parent, as a young person growing up. I've been interested in how we get the most out of people. My first career was in theatre. I was in the West End in Oliver as a 12, 13-year-old, and loved that sense of talent not just being something measurable in tests, but something that is something to nurture across the whole person. And as I got into education in the ministry, I think it became clear to me that there isn't a silver bullet, that this is a profoundly human endeavor, that you've got an infinite number of different humans interacting with each other in the course of delivering education. And what works for one person probably isn't going to work for everybody. And so it's as much of an art as it is a science. And so your work is never done. It's something you can always be thinking about and always be challenging yourself on, as long as you don't become fixed in your mindset, as long as the growth mindset, the sponge is still there. It's just a fascinating thing to try and create the best possible future for the largest number of children.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's something about the complexity. We're trying to create a big system to deliver education that we would have delivered in much, much tinier, smaller groups, historically. And so you've got to find a way to do that where there's a system which creates efficiency and means that we can kind of scale what we're trying to do, but also makes it really individual. And as you said, I love the idea of remembering this is a whole load of humans interacting with each other on a daily basis. And you're right, there's something about the complexity of knowing it's never going to be perfect, but knowing that every step you take forward can make a big impact on getting the best out of young people and enabling them to thrive.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess the other variable that's becoming larger, in my view, is the external environment and the pace of change in the external environment. So that in the past, perhaps, it might have felt like we were educating people into a relatively stable adulthood, where it was fairly predictable as to what they might need, what their destiny might be, I'm afraid. It was not and is not an equal world. And too often we had education systems that reinforced the sense of destiny. But I think now we're in an era both of driving towards more equity, so that people's destinies are not set by what school they go to, but also one where the labor market, the society, the world is changing extremely quickly.
Yes.
And we have to, in terms of sustainability, we have to move even quicker. And that then means the purpose of education becomes much, much more contested than I think it's been for a very long time.
Yeah. So I remember hearing you talk at the COBIS conference, the Council of British International Schools conference, and you were talking about how schools have been set up to prepare young people for the next step. So in some cases, that would be university or apprenticeships or straight into the workplace. And historically, that's how we thought of schools, as being a stepping stone to that. And you were talking about how your feeling is that education should be preparing young people to thrive in life. And yes, their next step is an important part of that, but it's much bigger than that. What are your thoughts on how we can make that shift in the education sector to help us to focus on preparing young people to thrive? I guess the first question is, how do we get our hands around that issue? How do we define what young people need to thrive? And then how can we help the education sector to really focus on that as opposed to just one next step in their process?
That's a really hard problem. And I've been involved on and off with various attempts to try and move the dial. So, for example, back in 2004-05, Mike Tomlinson produced a report for the Blair government suggesting doing away with A-levels and GCSEs and replacing them with a sort of 14 to 19 baccalaureate style qualification. And that wasn't accepted. And I had the job of trying to introduce 14 to 19 vocational diplomas, although we weren't allowed to call them vocational at the time. And in the end, that was cancelled by the incoming government in 2010 because they perceived it didn't work. And it wasn't too dissimilar to the T-level program, which is also going through some real difficulty in being landed here in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
These are really ambitious reforms to try and change things, to try and broaden the paths out of education into other things, and they've all really struggled. And I think in the end, we have a school system that is culturally geared towards helping universities select candidates for admission into undergraduate courses, and that try as we might to broaden that to create good pathways into apprenticeships and T-levels and whatever else. If culturally it's still just focused on that, it's focused on doing as well as possible at 11 to get into the best location, to then do as well as possible at 16 so that you can then be selected to do the best possible number of A-levels or whatever other qualification the universities will accept, so that you can then get into the best possible university. We all know that that's what drives the system.
Yeah.
And until we change that, I think we've got a problem. And I would love to be able to go to the university sector and say, look, at the moment, our whole school system is designed around paper and pen tests in large sports halls every summer that allow you to then select who you want as undergraduates. Is that the best we can do? Is there not a better way of you assessing the potential of candidates than paper and pen tests in sports halls? And if there is, let's work it out in such a way that you can do it pretty quickly. It might be a portfolio solution. It might, and we look at all the data that we're collecting anyway. And AI is an amazing prediction tool. Some of the AIs, there are all sorts of things that you could put into play, so that then we didn't have conditional offers, so that then we were separating off the function of schooling from the admissions of universities, and universities found their own way of assessing who to admit. That would be a great liberator for the school system.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, from knowing what I know of the university sector, the pressure on universities to have a financially viable business model, to put it frankly, is really, really great. And then you've also got the pressure, and some of this is political and some of this is social, coming in around people questioning the value of tuition fees for higher education. And is it really worth it? Basically, can I do this, getting into the career ladder in a different alternative way? And I think people are starting to question that end result of a university degree is essential. And so it starts to unravel backwards to some extent into actually the universities trying to figure out for themselves, what is our role in this system? Because they also want to be making sure that they are preparing young people to go out and thrive. And we're all trying to achieve the same goal, but the system isn't necessarily set up with the right incentives, especially where young people transition from one part of the system into another. For example, schools into universities. It's a really intractable problem.
It is, but look, I speak to some universities who are interested and excited about the possibility of change. They don't tend to be the more traditional research-based universities, but that's what being a strong incumbent does for you. But you're right that they are under acute financial pressure, that the return on a 50 grand debt it's still there statistically. That if you take that on and you get a university degree, you're still better off than if you don't. But it's eroding all the time, and there are now other alternatives that are quite viable. To degree apprenticeships, there are boot camp routes into high-paying professions. There are all sorts of other options that are available to young people, and I see other innovation around the world too. And I also, at COBIS, we see the data around what countries people are going on to university, and the UK is slowly falling behind, and that's, I think, a function of cost more than anything else. But you look at the rise of the Netherlands, for example, where if you can get admitted into great courses in universities like Maastricht, you're paying a fraction of the cost and getting a good outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the other areas that so we talked at the beginning about the complex system that we're talking about. And obviously this interplay between the school's curriculum and what universities need is one part of that system. Another part of preparing young people to thrive going forwards is giving them a sense of what the climate emergency means at a global scale, and also what action they can take, whether it's an individual or kind of a community scale. And I know that this is another topic that you feel really passionately about. Do you think we have opportunities actually to be thinking about how to weave sustainability across the whole curriculum as another way to ensure that actually our education system is helping young people to thrive going forwards? It's not just delivering young people into university courses.
Absolutely. I passionately believe that that's an important part of the change that we need to be able to see. When I think about young people thriving, I think in a very uncertain world and a very uncertain future for them, of course, we know that we're going to have to significantly change the way the whole economy works so that it's sustainable, so that it's no longer dependent on exploitation of the planet's resources at a pace that the planet can't replenish, and also that it's no longer dependent on the exploitation of other people in a form that is inequitable, because what we're now seeing is the state itself is becoming unfundable because we've got too many people dependent on the state and not enough people paying into the state through their taxes. And that's because of shifts in the economy away from when the current design was made after the war, when you had mass employment in factories, sort of hoovering up those people who were not great successes in school. That's kind of gone. And so we need a school system that universally succeeds for people. And our current curriculum and our current sort of knowledge-rich, highly academic focus just fails at least a third of kids. And we just can't afford it, crudely. And the sustainability principles are ones which basically say that you need to be good at caring for yourself, personal responsibility, caring for others, and caring for the natural environment for present and future generations. And if we had those principles, those three things at the core of what we're trying to do in education, teaching people the personal responsibility, teaching them empathy and how to help each other, and putting love into our system, and teaching them the actions that they can take to do things differently, to consume less natural resources, to replenish and recycle, to be more carbon positive, etc., then we've got a chance that this generation can be a generation that can pull us back from the brink.
Yeah, and all of this mirrors similar shifts that we're seeing in, for example, the corporate world, where we've got what would have been traditionally called for-profit corporates now looking at, triple line, bottom line accounting, looking at their impact on the people, looking at the impact on the planet as well as the profit. People really, the movement around the B Corp movement really gaining speed, where you've got companies that are using this accreditation process to prove that they have those social and environmental priorities embedded alongside profit, and it's the same. There's the same process, isn't it? Helping our education system to widen out from qualification focus, which is basically what we were talking about a few moments ago, into a much wider definition of success. And I see this as all part of a similar trend. It's being driven by a climate emergency that means we absolutely have to, without fail, very quickly adjust what we're doing. But it's actually part of a bigger social shift to be less dominated by one goal and more able to understand that there are multiple goals in our organisations and what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other important motivator for this is, particularly post-COVID, we've seen this rise in anxiety and mental health problems amongst young people.
Yes.
And, it's not just about climate anxiety. There's plenty of young people with anxiety just about how their family are going to keep the lights on and put food on the table. And, I chair a multi-academy trust that has a disproportionate number of disadvantaged children and families that we serve. And we see this coming through the door every day into our schools. But that sense of young people's anxiety about their future, about climate, about AI, about the mental health problems that they see around them amongst their cohort, we need to address, and we need to empower young people to feel like they have the tools to help themselves, to care for themselves, and a sense of, there's a great organisation called Ashton, a charity here in the UK. They have a campaign called Let's Go Zero, which is getting schools to pledge to be carbon zero by 2030. Now, that's quite a big ask, but thousands of schools have signed up to it. And part of the ask is that they would then come up with a plan to net zero that the whole school community would be a part of. And then starting to equip young people with that sense of, yeah, actually, my actions on my own are tiny. My actions of my family are something, and actually might make things more affordable in my own family. But the actions of my school community are much more significant. And if my school community is working with other school communities in my town and my city and my county, then we can start to be part of a movement that changes the behavior of the population. And however, I talk to a lot of nerdy climate experts who bang on about, tons of carbon and obsess about big infrastructure things, but they all agree that in the end, about half the change that needs to happen is just the general public changing their behavior. I can't think of a better route to changing public behavior than through education.
Yes. And again, it's widening the definition of what we're trying to achieve in education. And you're right, I've seen this firsthand, actually, that climate concern in young people, there's no one right way to address it for all children, but for many, it's helping them to understand how their small actions then multiply up because they're doing the same as their peers, the same as their families, the same as their communities. As you say, that ripple effect up through the schools community, the school sector, is one of the ways to make them feel more settled, but also to demonstrate to the rest of the world that our young people and our schools are taking action and then really shifting the dial and moving things forward.
Yeah, look, we just have to give people hope. Without hope, you don't take action. And the hope is young people themselves, and they have to be able to see that.
Absolutely, absolutely. The other topic I wanted to have time to talk about, and it's only going to be brief, we could do an entire podcast episode on this together, but AI is another area where I think it's really interesting to see through 2023. We've seen obviously the general population understanding much greater the power and the potential power in the next few years of AI. What's been really interesting is the journey that people have taken from being excited through hopeless, like what on earth are we going to do? We're not going to have any jobs, sort of a let's all despair sort of phase, and then coming through that, hopefully seeing in some of the press a little bit more of a balanced, nuanced discussion around AI. This isn't going to destroy everybody's jobs. It's just going to change the world substantially. And I think then towards the end of 2023, as we're seeing more international agreement and international discourse around how we're going to regulate this sector or have kind of large international organizations that are going to oversee some of these developments, again, it's about giving people hope that this is a positive movement towards, the impact of AI, and that we can, as a community, mitigate some of the negative sides of that. What are your thoughts around this? Discourse has often been, either you're in denial or you're leaning in. Like there are two ends of the spectrum, which camp are you in, which I think is really unhelpful. What are your thoughts on the impact of AI for education and where we should be placing our emphasis and our thoughts and our actions at the moment?
It is not a black and white issue. It's not AI bad or AI good. It is AI is not going away. We have to therefore work out how to ensure that it is deployed safely in the interests of children and the wider public, and in the interests of teachers, actually, because there are great opportunities for sort of virtual co-pilots, is the sort of trendy phrase these days, who can work as machines alongside you as a human and help you achieve what you need to achieve. Take workload away, give you insights, do assessment on the fly, a bunch of different possibilities, perhaps even solve the university admission problem that we should be grabbing for, whilst at the same time being really conscious that, as an example, the threat of misinformation and disinformation being massively amplified by the ability of AI tools in the hands of kind of everyone to be able to deep fake content, to be able to trick people into egregious fraud, etc. Those dangers are real.
Mm-hmm.
We're about 2024 is going to be a year. We're recording this at the end of 2023, but it's going to be a year of some really important elections around the world. And as a recovering politician, I'm terrified that we are behind the curve in regulating what the impact of AI might be on those elections. So it's up to legislators like me to quite quickly and aggressively work out, not through voluntary agreements, but through compulsion, how we protect people's privacy, protect truth, protect democracy, and protect the wider public interest from some of the potential dangers of AI, whilst then releasing it to do good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key thing that comes to mind for me is always that we need to be seizing the opportunities, protecting ourselves from the downsides, but it needs to happen quickly, because ideally the legislation is keeping up with the technology. And we know, and there are some amazing kind of charts out there with curves that show kind of the way in which the legislation and the regulation can often lag behind the technology. But the shorter we can get that lag, the better the regulation and the framework is going to be in which each of these technologies is developing. But because the speed of AI is now so much faster than anything technology kind of development that we've seen before, that means the speed of legislation and regulation needs to be faster. And our systems aren't brilliantly built to do that.
No, and we're culturally, and I see this also talking to school leaders and teachers, we're all used to being quite deliberative. And so everyone's kind of wanting to go, well, let's not rush it. Yeah. Let's just take our time and see what works and see where the problems really are. And then we can tackle them when they arise. And meanwhile, in the case of education, you got 70% plus of children who are using large language model AIs like ChatGPT to do their schoolwork, and they've sort of run off with it, and now they're going to go, well, hang on a minute, come back. Now that's just not realistic. And similarly, in the wider context, you've got big corporates now owning this technology and developing this technology in an unregulated way, and in a way that is, has some existential issues attached to it. And we do urgently need to get a grip on it. And there are things that I think we can do. And, I think quite a lot about the data itself that is used to train the algorithms, and how much we can lessen. I mean, the privacy is important, but there are other aspects of withholding data from the algorithm, so that and having some standards around what AIs are being used according to where the data's from.
Yes.
That we can think about. There's a bunch of different things that we can think about as regulators to try and get a grip on it.
Absolutely. And this impacts on copyright, it impacts on large kind of swathes of the legal framework around intellectual property. The impacts are so significant that we really need all different areas of society to be really focusing on this. And the challenge is it's focusing on it at the same time as other large challenges that we face, climate action and inequality being just two of those. Now, you're chair of a MACAT multi-academy trust in one of the most deprived areas of the country. You mentioned before how you're seeing in the school the impact of the cost of living crisis on the families and the children within the schools within that group. Simultaneously, you're also chair of COBIS, Council of International British Schools, supporting independent fee-paying British schools around the world. There's sometimes as you've alluded to in the few minutes ago, that there's sometimes a tension between these two sectors, but there are great opportunities for how the state sector and the independent sector can learn from each other and work together. What are your thoughts on the low-hanging fruit, if you like, the things that we should be doing really quickly to enable those two sectors to really work together for the benefit of all of our young people?
Yeah, and it's a really important question, particularly at the moment. Look, last week, I visited a bunch of schools in Thailand and Malaysia, independent schools. One of them, rugby school, Thailand. Apart from having amazing facilities, they had the slogan on their branding everywhere was the whole person, the whole point, which I loved. And that alone gives me inspiration. And then how they're then trying to translate that into using their freedoms, because they aren't regulated in the same way that the state-funded schools that I'm also responsible for are. So they can use freedoms around the curriculum, around what qualifications they offer. And yes, of course, they can use their resources too, but to better prepare people to thrive and better prepare young people with a more rounded education. And then I went to Charterhouse in Kuala Lumpur, where they're kind of going even one step beyond that. And yes, motivated in part by how can we get our students to stand out when they're applying to university over all of the others that are getting 3 A stars to C or whatever in their A levels. They're going, well, actually, if we think about their future and what they need for their future, they need to be great collaborators. They need to be great project workers. They need to be able to show that they can take theory into effective action. And that's their pedagogy. That it's been hard to find the teachers, I think, to do it really well, but they've got there. And so they are delivering the whole curriculum through project-based learning. And those students are then coming out with really good demonstrations of how their project work is leading to action in the real world. And that's just massively exciting and inspirational. So you can then go, oh, okay, this sector, this independent sector, has freedom and some resource to be able to try some things, to be able to experiment and become the sort of R&D for the rest of us. And whilst the regulated sector becomes a little slow to catch up, it will catch up and it can learn from all of that. And I think that's hugely important. And then there's a global teacher labour market that is struggling to have enough teachers in it. But I think the exchange that we can get with teachers moving between the independent and the state-funded sector, moving between domestic work and international work, and we need to do better at welcoming them back into particularly the state-funded sector when they've been overseas, but the wealth of experience that they can then bring. If you've worked in an international independent school, you're then used to dealing with interesting cultural environments with lots of different people from lots of different cultures, with some very tricky challenges. At the moment, the invasion of Ukraine, the attack by Hamas on Israel and the response by Israel in Gaza, these create really difficult tensions in these international communities. And so these are people who are delivering innovation and navigating some really challenging issues. And they should be valued and come back and enrich our system back here domestically.
And actually, so much that you've mentioned there that I wholeheartedly agree with. Just to pick up on one thing, you mentioned the project-based learning. This is something that I'm hearing schools talk about more and more and more. And actually, coming back to your previous comments around making sure that people have got that personal responsibility to care for themselves, the empathy to care for others, and the natural environment, sitting that alongside the project-based pedagogy, actually, I'm seeing that there's a real momentum behind some of these ideas, combining some of these ideas in order to enable the curriculum to actually deliver thriving young people who are then have the capability to thrive in whatever world evolves during the rest of their lifetime, which again brings us back to the beginning of our conversation about the purpose of schools.
Yeah, that's right. And a lovely thing in the Charterhouse School was that the young people are empowered by the leadership of the school. So, the school happens to be right next to a shopping centre, and so kids would be going out to get their food in the shops next door, but they stopped wanting to do that. So they wanted a cafe. So they were challenged, well, if you want a cafe, you better run a cafe then. And so you now have a pupil-run cafe facility, and then they wanted to rearrange the flow of the school. And, these young people are being listened to and giving agency, and they are happy, fulfilled, powerful individuals. And that's what
Yeah.
we want the school system to offer us adults, to help us out, to make sure that we all have a future.
Absolutely. And the personal resonance for me there is teaching young people entrepreneurial skills. I mean, I was never taught any of this stuff, but now running my own business, like, it's fascinating. And there are so many, the growth of the economy in kind of small and medium-sized businesses where people have the ability to really deliver value to other businesses or consumers and exchange for money effectively. This entrepreneurial spirit of being able to actually see the opportunity and then deliver it. If we can imbue in the next generation some of this stuff, and often it's done in a quite a sterile, classroomy kind of way. But the example you've just given there of guiding them through the process of setting up a cafe, absolutely spot on. It has real world impact. It benefits the pupils. They have agency, they have voice, but actually they also then have to take that personal responsibility as a group to make sure that's happening with the appropriate guidance, of course. And you did allude to the fact that finding the staff to deliver this type of curriculum is challenging, and there are obviously, you know, kind of limits on some of this, but seeing it happen in the independent school sector and then thinking about how we bring that back into the state funded sector is, as you say, is absolutely imperative as we move through the next kind of generation of education.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've been talking about some really high level things, some really great examples of what we talked about at the beginning of that complex system where there's no way of making it perfect, but everything we can do can take a step towards improving it, the art and the science of education. We've talked about the skill sets and the values and the way that we prepare young people to thrive in life, not just university. We talked about climate action, we talked about AI and inequality and how we look at inequality between the different parts of the school sector. Before we wrap up our conversation, I'd love to bring it right back down to kind of a daily kind of habit question. We often see that leaders in all businesses, not just schools, but certainly within schools, are incredibly busy. There's a huge amount of balancing that's happening every single day, of demands on their time, demands on their resource. And I wonder if you have any practical tips for leaders. Obviously, you balance a huge number of responsibilities, practical tips for how you can maintain focus on your goals and make sure that you're not getting distracted by all of those busy other things that are coming into your inbox. Any thoughts? How do you do it, Jim? How do you do it?
Well, look, my sense is you have to have moments in the day when you block out the noise and just have moments of calm and focus. So I start every day with 20 minutes of yoga. Mm-hmm. I often, if we can bend the diary to make it happen, my wife and I like to, once our daughter's gone off to school, just go for a walk for 40 minutes. And that opportunity to walk, to breathe in, to embrace the environment, but to talk. We're lucky we've got each other. Not everyone has got someone like that, but I think we all need someone that we can just check in with and reflect back the noise in our heads and then be able to make sense of it. Because just talking, none of this is new, but just talking about what's going on in your head in some way just lets it out. And then that frees you up. I've got really good friends who do amazing work on storytelling, and they talk about clearing the listening. So if they're going into an important meeting, then the two of them will say to each other, okay, let's clear the listening. And they just download without comment to each other on what they've said, what's bothering them in their heads, what's the noise in their heads. And they just verbalize it, articulate it, and then they've cleared it to have a focus meeting. And then they can come back and worry about those things afterwards.
That's fantastic. And a lot of it is about, the goal is to find clarity, isn't it? Clarity of your priorities for the day, clarity of your point of view about big issues, whatever it is, it's about finding clarity. And the processes that you've described there of clearing the mind of natural, we're human, we're going to keep thinking, you can't stop it. In my view, the idea of bending our thinking into positive thinking or trying to stop the thinking is just never going to work. But instead to acknowledge, okay, the thinking is there, let's somehow get it out of our head so it's not just buzzing around our head. We've said it out loud to somebody else. Doesn't really matter who, but someone who cares, I think, is important. They don't have to understand what you're saying. Don't have to be in the same sector to understand it, but someone who cares about you to then help your thoughts to settle. And that's when the clarity appears. And the clarity could be what I need to do today or what I need to do next. Or the clarity could be, my point of view on a big issue like climate emergency or AI.
Yeah. My mum's getting on a bit, and she lost her husband a year ago, and so I give her a call every day, and it can be that. It can just be, 10 minutes to your mum. She'd love that.
Yeah, mums are great.
And just, this is what's in my head. This is what's going on. But we all need someone.
Yeah, I'm lucky enough to have a husband and I do it too, although I also make sure I spread the load. So I do it to my mum and dad as well. And if they're listening, which they probably aren't, but thank you so much for all of you for giving me that opportunity to offload some stuff, which isn't rational, not logical, but it enables me to then find the clarity. Yeah. I'm glad that you've got the same for you as well.
Yes, we're lucky.
We are incredibly. A moment of gratitude at the end.
Julia, I'll share a final thing, which is we have a thing in our family that we have a biological family and we have a logical family. So we have some people who we include as our family members, even though they're not biological, because they're really important to us and there is a love between us that means, and we know that we can rely on each other in the way that we do family. And so there is that option for people. If they haven't got the same biological family, choose some people, bring them in.
Absolutely. It's about creating your support circle, your kind of adopted family that you're going to actually select to create that opportunity for calm. And I think that it's really important, and it comes right back full circle. I always try to find a way of creating the full circle. It's easy in this case for me. Back to the beginning of what we're talking about, education being a community of humans. And you mentioned that it means that it's complex. It means it's not always logical. There are emotions. There are all sorts of different diverse points of view in that community. But finding that human connection on a daily basis with someone who you care about and someone who cares about you, it's basically coming back to that human sense of how we perform at our best.
Yes. Yeah, totally. The AI thing means that we've got to be better humans just to compete with the machines. So let's all lean into our humanity.
100%. I'm going to finish on that. That's like a mic drop. The things the AI can't do is be human. And that's what we need all to be really focusing on. Thank you, Jim, so much. We could have talked probably for days about all these topics. These are big topics. I would love for you to come on the podcast again to get into more detail on some of these issues. Really exciting to have heard your points of view on these big things that are happening in our world at the moment. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks a lot.